Hi, everyone. I feel like I'm doing stand-up, so hopefully it'll be just as funny. Okay, so thank you all for joining this session about Chinatown. Really, I think today is really more about a discussion about whether or not Chinatown is here to stay. What is actually Chinatown's worth and value to Chicago, but also to the world? And so I think this is supposed to maybe help folks think about questions about Chinatown and how people can stay involved and be an ally to Chinese residents in Chicago. So I was born and raised in Chinatown. My parents actually owned a warehouse in Chinatown, and so I was very familiar with the grocery, the distribution, the logistics in Chinatown. And so obviously things have changed since then, but I think still the economy is still run similarly, which is very different from other neighborhoods. And so I really want to talk through some of that and the history of Chinatown and kind of the future of Chinatown. So, hi. Okay. Okay, so a little bit about Chinatown in general. So Chinatowns were founded in the late 19th century, but it was because of the gold rush. And Chinese laborers kind of came to the US seeking potential gold, but also really trying to find some cash, some money to bring back home, to send home to their relatives, or to back to their sponsors who may have helped them get to the US. And so a lot of the folks who had come originally actually ended up settling in the West Coast, specifically in San Francisco. And that is the first US located Chinatown. And from there, there's actually a lot of ethnic neighborhoods that kind of came up to be and have then later spread to the eastern part of the US. And it was because of the Transcontinental Railroad. So a lot of the laborers at that time ended up being some of the laborers for the construction of this massive railway system, but also they also included a lot more Chinese people to help with that type of labor. And as you might know, if you've ever visited any Chinatown in any city, major city that had a Chinatown, usually you would find them really close to their downtown, to the downtown or the core. And that is in part because most cities form kind of in the city center. But what's really unique is Chinatown was considered, or Chinese people were considered like slums or areas that people didn't want to go to. And so it was always kind of at the outskirts of downtown. And when downtown started expanding, it kind of encroached into these ethnic neighborhoods. And so it wasn't just Chinatown, it was Greektown, it was Jewish folks. It was just a lot of immigrant communities that would have just lived right outside of the business core. And that is not something that a lot of people talk about because way back when, there was this theory that you want to develop your downtown first, and that would be your core, and then there will be these concentric circles kind of outside of these areas where, according to this Burgess model, would have developed kind of like these communities in these fashions. And then outside of all of these like nasty slum immigrant communities would be like then good areas where people want to live. And so there were these circles kind of all throughout these major cities. And Chicago is one of them. So Chicago's Chinatown actually was located on Clark and Van Buren. So if you were to go back to this location today, it would be right by a transit stop, but it is also kind of across the street from a federal prison. But it wasn't there the whole time. So There actually was for a long time. If you actually go on that street, there are a bunch of SROs, or single resident occupancy establishments still on that street. But also, there was for a long time a Mexican restaurant that kind of took the Chinatown awning and then repurposed it and made it more of a Mexican, Chinese-inspired Mexican kind of awning for their restaurant. And if you still go to it, you'll still see it today. But that restaurant is no longer in place, but sometimes I secretly think, like, how much would it cost to, like, just purchase that and then just somehow hang it somewhere that's meaningful. But like, I think what we actually realized is that as Chinatown was kind of staying in that Clark and Van Buren area, where there were grocery stores and pharmacies and butcher shops, drugstores, they really wanted to continue to expand. However, there were a lot of threats of discrimination. There was these negative perceptions of Chinese people, particularly around opium smoking, around prostitution, around gambling, that made it still kind of undesirable to even be there. But over time, there were these little sparks of popularity, trends, that, such as chop suey. Does anyone know what chop suey is? It is a very popular Chinese dish, but originally it's not even a Chinese dish. It's kind of like the odds and ends of leftover things for that you wouldn't have cooked for anything else. And so then they packaged it and made it kind of popular for other people because it was cheap and it was easy to eat and it was like healthy. And so that became like one of the drawing points for people to actually go to Chinatown and like experience the culinary experiences of Chinatown. But with that, I think what's interesting about Clark and Van Buren is that blocks away would have been Grand Central Station. As I mentioned earlier, the Transcontinental Railroad played such a huge part of where Chinatown's located. But Grand Central Station actually was on Wells and Harrison, which would have been a couple blocks away. And when this Chinatown was established, it was basically from the 1880s through the 1920s. But what we know is that in 1890, there was, in that census year, there was just a little over 500 Chinese Americans that were documented in the census. And so that was kind of where it originally started. What was interesting is that you might know that Chinatown is no longer there. So in around 1912, Chinatown leaders kind of came together and decided that they really wanted to expand. And due to discrimination and rising rents, they felt like that was the only way to kind of get out of this area of Clark and Van Buren. So there was a major organization called the Unlearned Merchants Association that established that building that you see here, which is still in Chinatown, as the prominent location of the new Chinatown. And so even though this building was getting erected, most of the rest of Armour Square, which if you think of Wentworth, like further south, would have been fully Italian. And then around that area would have also been Irish. And so Chinese people were still discriminated against, but not necessarily to the degree when they were still in downtown. So the Unlearned Merchants Association, this interesting building, was like the first building. And at that time, there actually wasn't any legal Chinese architects. So they couldn't, the Unlearned Merchants Association actually could not hire Chinese architects to design this building. And so what ended up happening is they hired Norwegian architects to design this building with this kind of Eastern flair. So if you go to Chinatown on Wentworth and Archer, Wentworth and Cermak, you'll actually see this building still today. What's really interesting about this building is that it used to be the original Unlearned Merchants Association, but then over time, the building was raided by the FBI for racketeering, and then returned back to the community as the Pui-Tak Center, which it is today. So the racketeering charges were actually related to Al Capone. So it's kind of known that Al Capone used to gamble in this building, and rumor has it that the underground of this building has a intricate tunnel system that connects to the Chicago River and connects to the lake. That's how they were able to escape the cops. And so that is, I've never been down there, but I think that is often something that people talk about. So what's interesting is that when they were designing this building and this gradual move from Clark and Van Buren to what we know Chinatown today, is that there were actually people who didn't want Chinatown to move out of Chinatown that were not Chinese. They felt like they actually did protest. They felt like by moving Chinatown, they were increasing the risk of prostitution, of crimes, of other vices, because Chinatown was adjacent to the red light district. And the red light district is basically on State Street and closer to the lake, which may or may not have happened, but it was certainly an interesting way to protest a community establishing different roots. So I think that as we kind of think about this example, I think there are some examples where we're looking at how does place and people kind of convene or come together in different ways. So as Chinatown got more established in Chinatown along Wentworth, there were more family associations that propped up. So family associations in Chinatown, in any Chinatown, and in Chinese culture, are these kind of association or organizations that are based on your last name. So the most famous one in Chicago is the Moy Association. So the first documented founder or resident of Chinatown is actually Mr. Moy. And so he was able to bring his entire family over, and his family, I think, rolled like 40 people deep at that time. And so that was actually, and remains to be, Moy, like the surname Moy, remains to be the most common Chinese lineage in Chicago. But there are other associations. So family associations of different last names did still occur and were very popular. So if you actually walk down Wentworth, you can see things like the Wong Association, the Lee Association, other common last names that are Chinese. So as Chinatown grew, there were more amenities that Chinatown residents were able to take part in. So one of the things is this example of this older Chinatown library, this picture of Chinatown Library, like 22nd Street. But then there was also this Hardin Square Park. And Hardin Square Park was like on Wentworth and 26th Street. And you don't know about this park because it no longer exists. It was demolished because of the Federal Highway Act that happened in 1950s and 1960s, where they constructed I-55 and I-90, as well as the Cermak Chinatown Red Line Station. And so all of that was demolished and through eminent domain. And so that ended up landlocking Chinatown into what we know as today. So what's interesting is that Chinatown leaders at that time felt like all their resources were being taken away. So this is the park, the library, the field house, the swimming pool, and demanded that the city actually give these resources back and actually expand Chinatown instead of limit its physical space. And so leaders at that time actually spent years, decades, to fight for this thing called Chinatown Square. So Chinatown Square is actually on the northern end of Chinatown now. I'm sure if you go to Chinatown, you cannot tell the difference, which is fine. But it was only created in the 90s and early 2000s. As part of this agreement with the Santa Fe rail yard, which was defunct but acted like a parking lot for the trains that no longer really existed at that time in the late 90s and early 2000s, was this agreement to remediate the land and to expand and build more housing kind of along the river. And that born the Pingtown Park. So we have seen actually more retail establishments and more restaurants to have occurred in Chinatown. But as that time has gone, we actually have seen the shift away from this like mom and pop centric restaurants and businesses to more of these franchise, even if they're Chinese, franchise in the sense of like bubble tea shops or hot pot places, as well as hotels that are kind of like appearing in Chinatown. And so I think that has really changed what people are kind of thinking about when they come to Chinatown. And what's interesting is actually this how we're thinking about Chinatown in the future. So here's an example on the bottom. On the bottom, it's an example of a family association meeting. So people would just gather. This is like a place where people gather to kind of as a way to not necessarily assimilate into Western society. And like if there were any issues, they could resolve it there and then. And so it wasn't like you had to necessarily go to a city hall because there were leaders in the community that acted like a community city hall. And so any issues that you like encountered or anything that you actually wanted to experience. So like a lot of people wanted to find spouses, for example. That's how they were able to do that. Find homes, find schools. That was just like the way. Merchants Association and family associations were kind of these informal networks to kind of like acclimate into Western society, but also to Chicago and the US. So now that we have gotten to the place of like what's actually happening in Chinatown. So the rents have increased, and it is very close to downtown, and housing stock remains pretty low. And so the Chinese in Armour Square actually have started to decline, specifically in the business core, but has increased in this what we call Greater Chinatown. So Greater Chinatown is basically the four communities that is immediately west of Chinatown. So that includes Bridgeport, McKinley Park, and Brighton Park, where they have seen significant increases in Chinese population along Wentworth and along Halsted. And so because of these things, we have been seeing more business corridors along Archer and Halsted and other streets that have increased in Chinese restaurants, in Chinese grocery stores, and other like retail establishments. And a lot of people actually say like, well, that's a good thing because like now you have these new Chinatowns, mini Chinatowns kind of popping up in other places. But that doesn't necessarily also mean that resources or services are also going to these areas. We're just seeing kind of like the private market filling in these gaps. And that could be a good thing. It also could be a bad thing. And it's just like, how do we think about what are the actual needs as people continue to shift and move as well? So if you actually look at Chinatown today, you would see actually Chinatown residents generally have a lower median income as well as lower educational attainment. And typically do not speak English as their first language, and typically is Chinese, and it could be many different dialects of Chinese. But with that, I think it's important to kind of think about who's really at stake. And in Chinatown right now, actually, there's actually a significant amount of people who are kind of older and are seniors because there are more senior homes, but it is also a great place for aging in place. So a lot of the resources, whether that's social services or recreational services, Tai Chi in the morning, Mahjong in the afternoon, like there are still things where people find a sense of community, and that is not found in other communities. And so I think it is really important that people think about Chinatown like as this walkable, accessible place, and people can find culture here, but it is serving this like older senior population that is also living in Chicago. So if you actually look on that graph on the top, it is showing that the area median income levels compared to the Greater Chinatown area. And then on the bottom area, we're talking about people who are the different age groups compared to the rest of the city. So what's interesting is that Chicago, or in Chinatown specifically, there's been a lot of activism that has allowed something really meaningful to take place, which is elected officials being Chinese, being elected to these seats at this local and state level, when there were actually no representation at all for many, many decades, even though the population was growing. And that is in part because of really strong advocacy efforts around elections, but also on redistricting. And so redistricting only happens every 10 years, so it's really difficult to kind of predict and work with neighboring communities, which is like the Black community to the east and the Hispanic community to the west, trying to find the right balance of like how does Chinatown take claim to a growing and meaningful population that deserves a voice as well without infringing on populations that are just nearby. And so I think that is a question, an ongoing question of like how do we continue to think about representation in a way that actually represents residents in this area and beyond. The last thing I want to mention is a tough one, because I think at the end of the day, as we think about Chinatown or any community, it requires population and density to justify even a grocery store. And that really relies on a couple of things to happen. One is an influx of new residents, and that could be new immigrants, that could be people who are currently living in the suburbs or in another city moving to Chicago. It could also mean births. So like more babies that are being born end up staying in this area, remain in the area, and continue to grow in population. And then also this idea or notion that second, third, fourth generation families who maybe were born in Chicago and Chinatown stay in Chinatown or stay close to Chinatown. And so I think those are some like factors that really play a role in whether or not Chinatown in Chicago remains Chinese or remain Asian, or if it continues to be anything that it is today. And so there's a lot of like different things that I know when we talk about like displacement and gentrification, which we will in a second, there are just a lot of factors, and some of it is really challenging to discuss when there are other things at play. For example, what we've learned is there has been gentrification and displacement of other Chinatowns in the US. Some of the lessons that we've learned or have understood is that the cost of living typically is impacted very quickly. As Chinatown, the residents, the businesses tend to accept kind of like lower profit margins because they're kind of either taking out the middleman, so they don't necessarily have to go through another distributor. They can just go straight from the distributor to like a restaurant or to a grocery store. So typically the margins are not, like people understand when they open a restaurant or they open a shop in Chinatown, they typically believe that they're actually doing the community a good. And so they are willing to take less profit for what they're doing in the long run. And another factor is like the housing market. Not just like the stock of the housing market, but also the cost of it. So Chinatown, specifically Armour Square, what we have been seeing is that there's a lot of homes that are kind of older and they've been like passed down for generations and may not necessarily had good upkeep. So it is expensive to upkeep it. And so some people have opted to tear down their 2 or 3 flats to build a single family house. So we have been seeing some of the deconversions, which is impacting the cost of housing. We have also seen like the tear downs, when you rebuild, even if it's a 2 flat for a 2 flat or a 3 flat for a 3 flat, that construction and all these other costs are so high that you're almost forced to continue raising the rents. And so it then poses a problem for residents who actually want to stay here but may not necessarily have the financial means to do so. So like as I was talking about earlier, that typically residents have lower educational attainment, they have lower income jobs and may not necessarily even speak English to like get a job that may pay better. And so a lot of people actually end up working in restaurants, which is important, and nail salons, factories. So those are some very typical jobs that maybe immigrants tend to take because those are like things that they're more willing to understand and like know how to do. So that brings me to the next point, job security. And so when people feel like they can't stay in a job or they're like concerned that their job might be at risk, it is how like displacement kind of happens. It either happens through housing or it happens through businesses. So those are some things that like worth considering. And Chinatown is actually really interesting at its current place in time because Chinatown advocates have been asking for, demanding for many different types of neighborhood amenities. And so that could look like banks, but it could look like library. The newest library looks fantastic. And if you have a chance, you should visit it. Pingtown Park also took decades to build and now exists. And then it's also right next to the highway, has access, and also has good transit. So these things in any community is seen as a good or positive thing, and it's valuable. And so people tend to want or seek these valuable goods. And so some people are willing to pay top dollar to be in these neighborhoods. And oftentimes, because they're paying these top dollars, and people, Chinatown residents may not, it often poses this like displacement question about like how can residents, especially long-term residents who may continue to be priced out of the neighborhood, actually have a chance to remain. And that is an ongoing question. So then the other things that I've mentioned earlier is like the sense of community, which, you know, people know each other at this current stage in Chinatown, and they don't just know each other, they like know their whole family. So if you go to Chinatown, if you were born and raised in Chinatown, you know that specific scene. So it's like, it feels like home, right? Like people know this. People feel safe, people feel like they're taken care of, even if it's technically really strangers. And this cultural preservation piece, and it's through food sometimes, it's through language. So there are still like language classes that kids can take to like help kind of preserve the culture of Chinatown today. And then one really, really interesting thing is actually this. Generally, when we think about gentrification and displacement, we actually don't involve residents in the planning and development of the community. And so that is one thing that if we were to really hone in on, that is something that we can proactively plan for, is like, if we really do want to see positive change for the community, they should be a part of the planning for it. And it's typically not the case. So that is something that I am really passionate about. So I said a bunch of factors that have limited Chinatown, but also this like other piece is this: Chinatown is a microcosm of federal policies, and typically federal immigration policies. So where we are today is because of several different types of really large-scale immigration policies. So the first one being the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act was put in place because a lot of Chinese laborers came to build the railroad, to come here for the gold rush. And then people felt threatened and felt like their jobs were being taken away, which is a very relatable story today. It forced at that time, forced laborers out of the city and really the country overall. But then there were a series of really interesting, impactful immigration acts. So the first one is the Immigration Act of 1924. Followed by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which introduced national origin quotas. So if you were Chinese, there were only this limited number of Chinese people that could come in every year to be a U.S. citizen or to be a resident. It actually put some serious limits on the Eastern Hemisphere. So anybody from Asia of that sort would have been no more than 2% of the past census, which would have used the 1890 census, which they had to obviously undo that after a time, but still it really changed how Chinese people were coming to the US. And then in 1948, what was happening in China itself was this communist takeover of China and really fueled some strong immigration to the U.S., mostly because every country at that time had really lenient or lax immigration policies. Obviously that has an impact, but one of the most interesting one is actually the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which then actually removed the national origins quotas, but also prioritized immigration in a way that is how we understand it today, which is family reunification. So basically, if you had one family member that came to the US, you could petition your brothers, your sisters, your parents to come to the US as part of reuniting the family. And so that actually spurred a lot of the modern immigrants in the US in the late 60s. So what has happened since then, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, and 2000s in general, is the shift towards skilled workers. And so people who typically have degrees, have higher educational attainment, all across the board from any country. We have seen actually more well-off Chinese people coming to the US as a way to establish businesses, to buy homes, to do things that previous immigrants were not able to do as easily. And I think that's really an interesting thing as we kind of think about the shift in kind of the job market. The things that we might know Chinatown for may not necessarily appear the same way as we kind of move forward. There is this other last piece, which is we have this ongoing trade war or tariff problem under this current administration, where it's really difficult for a lot of these restaurants and businesses to kind of stay in a profitable situation. And so that is something that we are constantly trying to monitor to better understand how it might impact the community. So this image on the right is actually Chinese laborers who helped build the transcontinental railroad. Typically when you think of transcontinental railroad folks, Chinese people typically were not really depicted, especially were not photographed. So people tend to not really know that Chinese people actually built the transcontinental railroad. And there are actually a lot of historical records that show the impact the Chinese laborers had throughout all these centuries, really making an impact on the labor market and job security. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is this microcosm of global and national sentiment. Can anyone name some of the photos that's on the screen? Mahjong, okay. TikTok. TikTok. Bubble tea, okay. Gua sha, yeah, you got it. TikTok. Timu. Okay, so right now, we have gone from like this communist China to really this trendy, it's like trendy to be Chinese. So I hope maybe you have heard of some of these phrases already, but it's becoming more popular. So this idea of like becoming Chinese, Chinese baddie era, Chinese time of my life, and then Chinese maxing. So if you haven't heard these terms before, you will soon get TikTok ads for it because your phone is listening. So it is now really interesting to see kind of like this impact that Chinese people are having, or Asian people in general, because there's this like trend towards some like anti-Western sentiment, where this like material reality of American skepticism is like really taking a stronghold. Some people, if you like track social media, there's a lot of trends around wearing slippers, drinking hot tea in the morning, Chinese medicine, doing the Asian squat as part of your like morning routine, bubble tea, mahjong, these Tang or Mandarin jackets. It's not popular in the U.S. as right now, but it is very popular around the globe. It hasn't made its way to the U.S. yet, but Adidas has made these like Tang inspired, so the Tang dynasty inspired jackets, which you may be seeing a lot of these across many different retailers very soon because it is a very trendy thing. Then there's also a lot of people who understand dim sum and hot pot, and then cupping is also becoming a really big thing. But these are all like Chinese inspired and with Chinese origins, and it's becoming very clear that there is this kind of shift towards like this, like something different. And I think that could actually make an impact in Chicago's Chinatown, or Chinatown in general, local economy, but also like how Chinatown is perceived. And as we think about Chinatown, actually, Chinatown has never been fully Eastern and has never been fully Western. It has always been this blend of East meet West type of scenario where it's always like kind of an in-between. It's never really one or the other. And as we like think about food, we think about like how we consume food, it's always been kind of like in the middle. And some people actually call that like a Disneyfication. So like make packaging something in a way that's like appetizing or appealing to a general audience through like a lens of like entertainment. And because of that, I think there's a lot of people who kind of believe that that is the future of Chinatown, and that just continues to be how people, especially non-Chinese people, experience Chinatown. And I think as we kind of think about it and we get more sophisticated, how do we actually think about our role and our privilege and our ways of like thinking and being to actually help residents of these communities that really isn't just like something that we just experience one time or take part in or like pay for, and then that's like the end of our experience of a community that actually deserves much more than kind of like our one-time experience of it. So as we kind of think about that, I think this is like an important way to ground that conversation. So the other thing that I kind of want to wrap up with is like, we now know that there are a lot of concerns or like things for Chinatown, but there are some concerns as we think about the future of Chinatown. So Chinatown did celebrate its 100th year in 2012. that it's actually been in the Cermak Wentworth location for over 100 years now. It is really proximal to transit and highway access. It also has really good schools. And has a new library, has a new park, has relatively affordable housing. It's seen as really this is a desirable community, and crime is relatively low. So when we think about how other Chinatowns have experienced gentrification, is that usually it's through like a luxury development or a series of luxury developments that kind of like gradually increase the rents and property taxes. So then people do end up getting priced out. But we're also seeing deconversions that I mentioned before. We're also seeing more franchises that are opening up in Chinatown. Even though some are still ethnically Chinese, it is a really interesting way to think about what is the future. And then now, like I mentioned earlier, that new immigrants tend to rely less on social support, and so they're more likely to come to the U.S. already with means and ready to like work on their skilled jobs or to establish a business or something else. However, because of all these things, these factors, it's kind of hard to kind of predict what happens to Chinatown. However, I do have some serious concerns personally about the proximity of this neighborhood to some really large developments, undeveloped land around this neighborhood. So one of it being the Chicago Fire Stadium, or the 78, which is immediately adjacent to the Pingtown Park Fieldhouse. So the 78 is a 62-acre property that is due to be developed, and the Chicago Fire Stadium is supposed to be slated to actually be constructed later this year, which may or may not have impacts on this community at large, but will impact it whether it's positive or negatively. Then there's also the McCormick Place, or Motor Row, which would be east of Chinatown. There's a lot more tourism happening because of the expansion of McCormick Place, especially before COVID. But now with COVID, I think tourism is still kind of like in the middle, but they're still trying to find the right footing. But there's still a lot more people who are trying to establish in Motor Row. So there are some like new restaurants and like interesting things that are kind of popping up there. And then just a little south of us is this Michael Reese redevelopment, which used to be a hospital system, and now is going to be this mega development called Bronzeville Lakefront. There is supposed to be entertainment and other things, developments that are going to happen nearby. And because Chinatown kind of sits in the center of all of that, it is going to be interesting to see what happens to the businesses and the residents of this area, and if it continues to move or shifts west, like I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to leave you with some key questions to think about. We can answer some of them together. You can ask more questions after this. So really, I think these questions are some of the questions that I grapple with as a sociologist and urban planner. Like, as I think about population and think about people, I think about how the impact of place shapes and shifts some of the ways that we think about power and privilege. So who is Chinatown for? Is it supposed to be this melting pot for Chinatown Chinese residents, for Asian American residents? Like, who's at stake? Who gets a stake in this, and who gets a piece of this pie if it does change in positive or negative ways? And is displacement and gentrification possible, or is it likely? Is it a natural phenomenon? A lot of people consider this as like a natural phenomenon based on like market pressures and the way that we think about private market. And then, but if that's the case, is it preventable? And if the displacement, is it still displacement if it's richer Chinese people kind of taking over poorer Chinese people, but they're still Chinese? And then in a hyper-segregated Chicago, is integration the answer? Should it just not be Chinese anymore? And then this other question that I posed earlier is like, will Chinatown or these mini Chinatowns, if they continue to pop up, will that naturally just rebuild somewhere else? So this is a really common thing actually that people talk about, especially in the New York context, because New York's gentrification has gotten to the point where they started building new Chinatowns in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, in Queens, and so things have also shifted there as well, but we're not necessarily seeing the resources also popping up in those areas. And then this other last question is like, what are the long-term economic impacts of COVID in this post-COVID world, but also this tariff on these neighborhoods that kind of are essential in the small business world, reliant on international trade. And if that changes, that makes that calculation, maybe small business owners no longer want to establish like a retail shop or anything like that because they're not making that profit. So all of that is more to come. As Patty mentioned, I do a Chinatown tour that typically sells out pretty quickly. But if you hated this, you do not want to go on the tour. So if there will be more information that gets circulated around that. But thank you for being here.